If you'd stood on the edge of the South Bronx before November 2025, you would have seen a specific patch of water dominated by a 5-story steel fortress. This fortress weighed over 47,000 tons and it sat there for 33 years. It held 800 men in cages, floating on the tide. New Yorkers knew it as the boat. Inmates inside called it the slave ship. But officially, it was Vernon C. Bain Correctional Center, the largest operational prison ship in the history of the world. It was a $161 million experiment that ended on November 5, 2025 in a massive maritime operation. The city disconnected the whole facility and dragged it away forever. So why did New York build a prison on water? How do you engineer a jail that floats on the tide? And how do you make something this massive disappear forever? This is the story of a disaster, a tragedy, and the long journey to make a mistake disappear. To understand why this vessel was built, we have to look at New York City in the late 1980s. The city was in the middle of the crack cocaine epidemic. Violent crime was at historic highs, with 2,245 murders recorded in 1990 alone. Naturally, that crime wave led to a massive surge in arrests, which completely overwhelmed the jail system. Rikers Island was operating at 110% capacity. The city needed 2,000 new beds immediately. The overcrowding got so severe that inmates were forced to sleep on gymnasium floors, in hallways, and even in holding cells for weeks at a time. Eventually, the conditions got so bad that the federal court stepped in and ordered the city to relieve the overcrowding immediately. This left Mayor Ed Koch with a difficult dilemma. He needed thousands of new jail beds right away, but building them on land was politically impossible. Every time the city proposed a site in Queens, Brooklyn, or Staten Island, residents protested. Put simply, no one wanted a detention center in their backyard. So, with no options on land, city planners looked to the water. This concept wasn't actually new. Centuries earlier, the British had used old warships known as prison hulks to house convicts. New York decided to modernize the idea. They commissioned a purpose-built floating prison barge capable of holding 800 inmates. The plan was to build it off-site, float it in, and dock it in an industrial zone largely out of public view. The goal was a solution that was fast, cost-effective, and low-profile. In the end, it proved to be none of those things. The contract was awarded to Avondale Industries in New Orleans, a shipyard best known for building Navy destroyers. The project faced massive delays and cost overruns from the start. In reality, the project was anything but simple. The engineers had to satisfy 3 completely different rulebooks at the same time: Coast Guard maritime regulations, Department of Corrections security standards, and New York City building codes. Often, these rules directly contradicted each other. Take the ventilation system. In a normal building, you can have large windows or vents, but on a prison barge, you have a sealed steel box sitting in corrosive salt air. Large ducts pose a security risk because inmates could crawl through them, but small ducts restrict airflow. The engineers eventually settled on a compromise: a dual-layer ventilation system with interior ducts feeding into larger, caged exterior vents. Inmates couldn't reach the outer layer, and the airflow could move freely. But the system was so complex it required constant maintenance. To make matters worse, the salty air from the East River began to corrode the equipment almost immediately. Filters failed and ductwork rusted, leading inspectors to reject the work repeatedly. Then there was the issue of fire safety. Evacuating a burning building is difficult enough. Evacuating 800 inmates from a floating steel box is even harder. The final decision included a military-grade sprinkler system with backup pumps and an evacuation barge protocol that could dock within minutes. It met the codes, but barely. The fire detection system alone caused months of technical delays. By the time the barge was finally cleared for delivery, the final price tag was $161 million. That's roughly $400 million in today's dollars, enough money to build 10 new high schools in the city for just 800 beds. And here's the irony. By the time the barge actually arrived in 1992, the jail population had started to drop. A city official later admitted that the money was clearly misspent. But the city had already paid the bill, so they felt they had no choice but to use it. But before they could use it, they had to move it, and that was a mission in itself. This barge was built in Louisiana, which means it had to get to New York somehow. And remember, it's a barge. It has no engines. So in January 1992, tugboats dragged this rectangular box, the length of 2 football fields, 1,800 miles. They pulled it down the Mississippi River, across the Gulf of Mexico, around the tip of Florida, and all the way up the Atlantic coast. When it finally arrived in New York Harbor, they parked it at Hunts Point in the South Bronx. But since the ship couldn't generate its own power, they had to plug it into the city. They connected massive power, water, and sewage lines from the shore. These lines, known as umbilicals, had to be flexible, because the tide makes the East River rise and fall several feet twice a day. The ship had to be able to float up and down without snapping its life support. Once those lines were connected, the Vernon C. Bain Center was officially open for business. From day one, inmates and activists called it a modern-day slave ship. You had hundreds of black and Latino men locked in the hull of a ship, completely cut off from the land. But the physical experience of being on this barge had its own kind of torture. Even though the ship was tied to the dock, it wasn't stable. The river currents made the whole jail rock back and forth. Inmates talked about constant seasickness, dizziness, and the feeling that the ground was never solid. Then there was the noise. Imagine living inside a steel drum. You could hear the water slapping against the hull, the ropes groaning under the tension, and the constant industrial hum from the wastewater plant next door. And because it was a metal box in the water, it was always damp. Cold river water on the outside and hot air on the inside caused condensation. The walls rusted, the ceilings leaked when it rained, and the smell of mold and diesel fuel never went away. For some, the conditions were fatal. One former inmate, who was just 18 at the time, described being beaten and pepper-sprayed by guards. When he tried to complain, they made him a deal. Stay quiet about the abuse, and they would find his lost bail paperwork. He took the deal just to get out. Others weren't so lucky. In 2021, Stephen Cardew died after catching a disease carried by rodents. His family said the damp, rotting ship was infested with pests. And in 2022, Gregory Acevedo climbed the fence on that rooftop court and jumped 50 feet into the dark water below. He didn't survive. It was a desperate act that showed just how hopeless the place had become. But that's not it. Because the barge was technically a ship, the city had to follow Coast Guard rules. That meant they were legally required to have a full maritime crew on board 24/7. We're talking about a captain, an engineer, and an oiler, the crew member who maintains the mechanical systems. Their job wasn't to guard prisoners. Their only job was to make sure the jail didn't sink. The city paid $650,000 a year just for that crew. On top of that, the salt water was destroying the ship. So it just stayed there, rotting in the harbor. Until finally, the movement to close Rikers Island changed everything. By 2023, the world had changed. That same jail crisis that spawned the barge in 1990 had reversed completely. New York's population behind bars dropped from a peak of 22,000 down to under 6,000. The city voted to close Rikers Island completely and move towards smaller local jails. The massive floating prison wasn't needed anymore. So in November 2023, the last inmates were transferred off the boat. And for the next 2 years, it just sat there. But that left the city with a huge problem. How do you get rid of something larger than most ocean freighters? You can't just throw it in a dumpster. You need a specialist. So the city hired Louisiana Scrap Metal Recycling to tow the beast through the open ocean and chop it up. The date was set for November 5th, 2025. That morning, a fleet of tugboats gathered in the East River. Workers cut the thick mooring lines that had held the barge in place for 33 years. They disconnected the power and water cables. And then, slowly, the massive blue and white structure drifted away from the Bronx. It floated past Rikers Island one last time, passed under the bridges, out into the Long Island Sound, and began retracing the same route it took 33 years earlier, back to Louisiana. And here is the final twist. The city didn't have to pay millions to get rid of it. The high-quality steel was so valuable that the recycling company actually paid New York $1.5 million to take it. The barge that cost $161 million to build was sold for scrap metal. So this site won't stay empty. It's being transformed into the Hunts Point Marine Terminal. This pier will now be used to move goods. Barges will bring shipping containers directly to the waterfront. The change is expected to significantly reduce traffic stuck in the South Bronx, cleaning up the air in a neighborhood that desperately needs it. The project is creating hundreds of jobs and driving major economic investment in the area. Plus, the waterfront, which was fenced off and patrolled by armed guards for decades, is finally being opened up to the public with new bike paths and parks. The Vernon C. Bain Correctional Center was a solution born out of panic. But that massive investment is about to pay dividends. The same site that symbolized everything wrong with the system is now creating jobs, cleaning the air, and opening up the waterfront to the public. Right now, the steel is being melted down. Maybe it will become a bridge or a skyscraper or even a wind turbine. The metal will live on, but the floating jail, it's gone, and New York is finally moving forward. So you tell us, do you think this project was a necessary evil for a city in crisis, or one of the biggest wastes of money in New York's history? Do you think replacing a floating prison with a working port is the right move? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy Megabuild stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.